At precisely 17 minutes past 9 on the morning of January 22, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George found himself in the shattered remnants of a Japanese fortification west of Point Cruz. He was observing a banyan tree, a distance of 240 yards away, through a telescopic sight that his fellow officers had derided for the preceding 6 weeks. At 27 years of age, he was an Illinois state champion marksman, yet his record showed 0 confirmed enemy eliminations. The Japanese forces had deployed 11 snipers within the Point Cruz groves, and in the preceding 72 hours, these marksmen had claimed the lives of 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. George's commanding officer had dismissed his rifle as a mere plaything. Other platoon leaders referred to it as his mail-order sweetheart. When he had unboxed the Winchester Model 70 with its Lyman Alaskan scope and griffin and how mount at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the armorer had inquired whether it was intended for game or for Germans. George had clarified that it was for the Japanese. They had deployed overseas before the rifle had even arrived. George had spent the sea voyage to Guadalcanal watching other soldiers meticulously clean their garrons while his own prized firearm remained sequestered in a warehouse in Illinois. He had submitted a request for it to be forwarded through the military postal service. 6 weeks later, in the waning days of December, 1942, a supply sergeant presented him with a wooden crate, conspicuously marked fragile. Within lay the rifle he had diligently saved 2 years of National Guard pay to acquire. The rifle itself weighed 9 pounds. The scope added an additional 12 ounces. The standard issue Garand, issued to every other man in his battalion, tipped the scales at 9.5 pounds, entirely devoid of any magnification capabilities. George's rifle was a bolt-action, capable of holding 5 rounds. The Garand, in contrast, was semi-automatic, with an 8-round capacity. Captain Morris had strictly ordered him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and to carry a standard military weapon. Nevertheless, George carried his own rifle. The 132nd Infantry Regiment had replaced the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December of 1942. The Marines had been engaged in continuous combat since August. They had secured Henderson Field. They had defended it, but they had failed to capture Mount Austin, and they had not succeeded in clearing the Japanese from the coastal groves west of the Matanico River. Mount Austin loomed, 1,514 feet in height. The Japanese referred to it as the Ju, and it was defended by 500 men within 47 bunkers. George's battalion launched its assault on December 17. They fought relentlessly for 16 days. They suffered 34 fatalities and 279 wounded before they finally achieved control of the western slope on January 2. By that juncture, George had discharged his Winchester exactly 0 times in any combat engagement. The dense jungle surrounding Point Cruz presented a vastly different challenge. There were no fixed fortifications, no entrenched positions, only Japanese soldiers who had retreated westward from Henderson Field and entrenched themselves within the massive trees. Some of these soldiers were adept snipers. They were armed with scoped Arisaka Type 98 rifles. They possessed an intimate knowledge of the jungle. They understood the art of patient waiting. On January 19, a sniper fatally shot Corporal Davis as he was filling canteens at a creek. On January 20, another sniper eliminated 2 men from L Company during a reconnaissance patrol. On January 21, 3 more soldiers perished. One of them was struck through the neck from a tree that the patrol had unwittingly passed by on 2 separate occasions. The battalion commander summoned George that night. The Japanese snipers were proving more lethal than malaria. He desperately needed someone with exceptional marksmanship. He inquired if that mail-order rifle possessed the capability to hit its intended target. George detailed his qualifications. He had secured the Illinois State Championship at 100 yards in 1939. At 23 years of age, he was the youngest victor in the state's history, capable of achieving 6-inch groupings at 600 yards with iron sights, and with the Lyman Alaskan scope, 5 rounds within a 4-inch circle at 300 yards. The commander granted him until morning to demonstrate this proficiency. Should you wish to witness how George's civilian rifle performed against Japanese snipers expertly trained for jungle warfare, kindly engage the like button. Your participation assists us in sharing more of these overlooked narratives. And please, subscribe if you have not already done so. Now, returning to George. George dedicated the night to meticulously inspecting his rifle. The Winchester had been coated in cosmoline for its ocean voyage. He meticulously cleaned it once more. He verified the integrity of the scope mounts. He loaded 5 rounds of .30-06 hunting ammunition, which he had packed in Tennessee. These were military ball cartridges, the identical caliber fired by the Garand. At first light on January 22, George advanced to his designated firing position within the ruins of a Japanese bunker that his battalion had captured 3 days prior. The fortification offered a commanding view of the coconut groves to the west of Point Cruz. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese snipers operated from the immense trees in that vicinity, specifically the banyan trees. Some of these colossal trees soared to heights of 90 feet, with trunks measuring 8 feet in diameter. A sniper could ascend one of these trees before dawn and remain concealed throughout the day, entirely undetected. George had brought no spotter, no radioman, only his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition contained in stripper clips. He assumed his position in the bunker and commenced his surveillance of the trees through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan provided 2.5 power magnification. While not exceptionally high, it was sufficient to discern subtle movements within the branches that the naked eye would undoubtedly miss. The jungle was never truly silent. The chirping of birds, the incessant drone of insects, the distant rumble of artillery fire all contributed to the cacophony. George had cultivated the ability to filter out this ambient noise and concentrate solely on detecting movement. He meticulously scanned the trees, moving from left to right, from top to bottom. At precisely 9:17, he observed it. A branch swayed. There was no discernible wind, only a minute displacement. 87 feet above him, within a banyan tree situated 240 yards away. George continued his vigil. The branch shifted again. Then, he discerned a shape. A man, clad in dark attire, positioned within a natural fork where 3 large branches converged. The Japanese sniper was facing eastward, intently observing the trail utilized by George's battalion for the transport of supplies. George adjusted his scope, making 2 clicks to the right to compensate for windage. He consciously regulated his breathing. The trigger of the Winchester possessed an exquisitely smooth action, requiring a 3.5-pound pull. He had dedicated countless hours to its fine-tuning at Camp Perry prior to the commencement of the war. Now, he was about to ascertain whether a civilian target rifle was capable of dispatching a man trained to kill him first. George gently squeezed the trigger. The Winchester recoiled forcefully into his shoulder. The report of the shot reverberated sharply through the jungle. 240 yards distant, the Japanese sniper spasmed and plummeted. He dropped through the dense foliage, his body tumbling 90 feet before impacting the ground near the base of the banyan tree. George promptly manipulated the bolt. The spent cartridge ejected. He chambered another round. He maintained his scope's focus on the tree, intently awaiting further movement. Nothing. The sniper's accomplice would be nearby. Japanese snipers operated in pairs, typically consisting of a shooter and a spotter. If George had just eliminated the shooter, the spotter was likely concealed within that same tree or in the adjacent ones. George meticulously scanned the surrounding banyans. The scope's 2.5 power magnification necessitated a deliberate and slow search. Each tree could potentially harbor multiple individuals. The dense jungle canopy cast deep shadows, rendering shapes indistinct and requiring careful observation to distinguish them. At precisely 9:43, he located the second sniper. This individual was positioned in a different tree, approximately 60 yards to the north of the first. This sniper was situated at a lower elevation, perhaps 50 feet from the ground. The Japanese soldier was descending the trunk, evidently in retreat. He had undoubtedly heard the gunshot and recognized that his position had been compromised. George aimed, compensated for the sniper's movement, and fired. The second sniper toppled backward from the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him. Both bodies struck the jungle floor within mere seconds of each other. 2 shots fired, 2 enemy combatants eliminated. George reloaded his Winchester using a stripper clip. His hands remained remarkably steady. His breathing was controlled. This situation bore no fundamental difference from engaging targets at Camp Perry, with the singular exception that the targets were actively returning fire. At 11:21, a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag position 6 inches from George's head. The impact flung dirt directly into his face. He rolled swiftly to his left and pressed himself firmly against the bunker wall. The projectile had originated from the southwest. This indicated a different sector of fire than the first 2 snipers. George patiently waited for 3 minutes before initiating any movement. He cautiously maneuvered back to his firing position and resumed scanning the trees to the southwest. The shooter would have undoubtedly repositioned himself after discharging his weapon. This was basic sniper doctrine. Shoot and relocate. However, within a jungle this dense, the options for relocation were severely restricted. George finally identified him at precisely 11:38, situated in the 3rd tree from the left within a cluster of 5 banyan trees, approximately 73 feet high. The Japanese sniper had relocated to a different branch but remained within the same tree. This was a tactical error. George placed the crosshairs directly on the dark shape and fired. The 3rd sniper descended without uttering a sound. By noon, George had successfully eliminated 5 Japanese snipers. News of his prowess spread rapidly throughout the battalion. Soldiers who had previously mocked his mail-order rifle now eagerly inquired if they could observe his operations. George adamantly refused. Spectators invariably drew attention, and attention, in turn, invited hostile fire. The Japanese snipers adapted their tactics following the 5th elimination. They ceased all movement during daylight hours. George spent the entire afternoon meticulously scanning the trees, but observed no further activity. At 1600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was awaiting his arrival. The tone of mockery had completely vanished from his voice. He implored George to resume his position at dawn. January 23 commenced with a torrential downpour, intense tropical rain that transformed the jungle floor into a muddy morass and rendered the trees virtually invisible beyond 100 yards. George remained ensconced in the bunker, patiently awaiting a cessation of the weather. The rain abated at precisely 8:15. By 8:45, sufficient visibility had returned to resume operations. George identified the first sniper of the day at 9:12. The Japanese soldier had ascended to his firing position during the rainfall. This was a shrewd tactic. The sound of the rain would have masked his movements. This sniper had selected a tree situated 290 yards away, a considerably longer range than the previous day's engagements. This, too, was a prudent decision, as they were clearly assessing his capabilities. George compensated for the increased distance and fired. The sniper tumbled. The 6th confirmed kill elicited a response that George had not anticipated. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began bombarding the immediate vicinity of his bunker. They had evidently triangulated his position based on muzzle flash or the distinct sound of his rifle fire. The initial rounds impacted 40 yards short of his position. The subsequent salvo landed 20 yards short. The 3rd salvo, George realized with chilling certainty, would strike the bunker directly. Grabbing his rifle, George broke from cover and sprinted. He dashed northward along the tree line and dove into a shell crater. As the 3rd salvo detonated, the bunker he had occupied mere moments before was engulfed in a maelstrom of explosions and flying debris. He relocated to a new position. A fallen tree situated 120 yards north of the obliterated bunker. This fallen tree offered both concealment and an unobstructed view of the surrounding groves. George settled in and resumed his watchful vigil. The Japanese deployed additional snipers that afternoon. They were fully aware that George was actively hunting them. Consequently, they had commenced hunting him in return. The dynamic of the engagement had fundamentally shifted. This was no longer a matter of target practice. This had evolved into a deadly duel. At 14:23, George eliminated his 7th sniper. At 15:41, he accounted for his 8th. This particular adversary had ascended to a considerable height, 94 feet up a banyan tree. While this offered excellent concealment, the extreme elevation created a stark silhouette against the sky as the sun's angle shifted. At 1700 hours, Captain Morris dispatched a runner to recall George. George had maintained his position for 9 arduous hours. Morris was eager for confirmed numbers. George reported 8 confirmed kills over the course of 2 days. This had required 12 rounds fired, resulting in 8 successful engagements and 4 misses. Morris subsequently assigned George to continue his dedicated sniper operations, commencing at dawn on January 24. That night, George meticulously cleaned his Winchester and contemplated the stark mathematics of the situation. 11 Japanese snipers were known to be operating within the Point Cruz groves. 8 of them were now deceased, leaving 3 remaining. These 3 would undoubtedly be the most formidable, the ones who had evaded capture and elimination for the longest duration. Furthermore, they now possessed precise knowledge of George's appearance and the specific rifle he carried. George loaded his Winchester with 5 fresh rounds and attempted to rest. At 300 hours, however, he abandoned the effort and sat in his tent, the rifle resting across his lap. The rain commenced again at 4:15. By 5:30, it had intensified to such a degree that dawn operations would be inevitably delayed. George utilized this unforeseen respite to reposition himself. He eschewed the bunker and the fallen tree, opting instead for a location where the Japanese would least expect him. He selected a spot situated 70 yards south of his previous position, a cluster of large rocks that the Marines had utilized as a machine gun emplacement back in December. This vantage point offered excellent cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. He settled in and patiently awaited the cessation of the rain. At 7:43, the rain subsided to a mere drizzle. Visibility began to improve. George initiated his methodical scanning of the trees. At 8:17 on January 24, he discovered sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree, 290 yards distant. This was an unusually low elevation, only 40 feet from the ground. Most snipers ascended to greater heights to optimize their sight lines. This particular adversary had opted for concealment over elevation. The palm fronds provided a natural camouflage that would render him virtually invisible from ground level. However, George was not positioned at ground level. He occupied an elevated position on the rocks. This altered angle afforded him a downward view into the dense fronds. He could discern the dark silhouette of the sniper's shoulders and head. George aimed, regulated his breathing, and began to gently squeeze the trigger. Then, he paused. Something felt amiss. The position appeared too obvious, too easily accessible. George had been actively hunting snipers for 3 consecutive days. He had eliminated 8 enemy combatants. The remaining 3 would not commit elementary tactical errors. They would not place themselves in a situation where an elevated shooter could readily detect them, unless it was a deliberate ruse, a carefully laid trap. George lowered his rifle and meticulously scanned the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm tree was indeed a decoy, the true shooter would be positioned to observe him, awaiting anyone who took the bait, anticipating muzzle flash, and ready to deliver a retaliatory volley. George systematically swept his gaze across the trees, moving from left to right, and from top to bottom. He meticulously examined every tree within a 300-yard radius of the palm. This painstaking process occupied 11 minutes. At precisely 8:28, he located the genuine threat. A banyan tree, positioned 80 yards northwest of the palm, standing 91 feet high. The Japanese sniper occupied a position of perfect concealment. Branches and vines effectively obscured him from three sides. He possessed a clear line of sight directly to George's previous location at the fallen tree. He was evidently waiting for George to reappear at the fallen tree or to engage the decoy in the palm. George was now confronted with two significant problems. Firstly, the actual sniper was observing the incorrect sector. If George were to fire at him, the resultant sound would immediately reveal George's actual whereabouts. The sniper would then relocate with extreme haste before George could work the bolt and chamber another round. Secondly, if George remained inactive, the sniper would eventually deduce that George was no longer at the fallen tree and would initiate a comprehensive search for his current position. George resolved to utilize the bait against his adversaries. He aimed at the decoy sniper in the palm tree, adjusted for windage, and fired. The decoy sniper jerked violently and plummeted from the palm. George immediately swung his rifle toward the banyan tree, 91 feet high. The actual sniper would undoubtedly react to the gunshot. He would turn his attention toward the source of the sound. That movement would create a discernible shift in his position. George observed it. A subtle, almost imperceptible alteration. The sniper was evidently repositioning himself to face George's inferred location. George placed the crosshairs precisely on the dark shape and fired before the sniper could fully complete his turn. The genuine sniper fell. His rifle tumbled after him. 2 shots fired, 2 enemy combatants eliminated. However, George had now inadvertently revealed his position to any other potential observers. He swiftly retrieved his rifle and ammunition and initiated a rapid movement. He traversed eastward along the rock line and plunged into a drainage ditch situated 40 yards away. He pressed himself deep into the mud and awaited further developments. At precisely 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire swept across the rocks where he had been positioned a mere 6 seconds prior. The bullets kicked up plumes of dust and fragments of stone. The sustained fire lasted for 17 seconds. Once the barrage ceased, George counted to 60 before daring to move. He relocated once more, this time to a position 100 yards further east, a shell crater partially inundated with rainwater. George settled into the crater, with the water reaching his chest. He rested the Winchester on the crater's rim and resumed his methodical scanning of the trees. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. The 11th sniper would undoubtedly be the most adept, the most cunning, and the most seasoned. He had witnessed the demise of 10 of his comrades over 3 grueling days. He was intimately familiar with George's tactics. He knew George's rifle. He had an approximate understanding of George's current location. And somewhere within those dense trees, he was observing, patiently waiting, meticulously planning his next move. George meticulously scanned the jungle through his scope. The magnification of the Lyman Alaskan rendered distant shapes discernible, but not definitively identifiable. Every dark anomaly could represent either a mere branch or a concealed enemy combatant. George was compelled to study each one with extreme care. At 9:47, he recognized his critical error. The 11th sniper was not situated within the trees. He was on the ground, and more alarmingly, he was moving directly toward George's present position. George perceived the movement at the periphery of his vision, approximately 60 yards to the south, low to the ground. A dark shape was traversing the dense undergrowth, moving parallel to the tree line. The Japanese sniper was skillfully utilizing the jungle floor vegetation for concealment. Ferns, vines, and fallen branches provided ample cover. He was crawling directly toward George's last known position at the rocks. George remained perfectly motionless within the water-filled crater. The Winchester was already shouldered. His breathing was controlled, but the firing angle was critically disadvantageous. The rim of the crater obstructed his direct line of sight to the approaching sniper. George would be compelled to rise slightly to acquire a clear shot. Such an action, however, would invariably expose him. The Japanese sniper ceased his movement at precisely 9:52. He had advanced to a position 40 yards from the rocks. George observed him through his scope. The sniper was intently studying the rocks, diligently searching for any sign of movement, any indication of his quarry. George waited. Patience, he knew, was the paramount virtue in sniper operations. The innate ability to remain utterly still, to permit time to elapse, to await the opportune moment rather than forcing a precarious shot. At 9:58, the Japanese sniper resumed his advance. He crawled forward another 35 yards from the rocks. 30 yards, 25 yards. He was approaching from the south, the very flank George had utilized when he evacuated under heavy machine gun fire. George immediately grasped the sniper's calculated tactic. The Japanese sniper had clearly observed the machine gun engagement. He understood that George had moved eastward from the rocks. He was now systematically traversing the most probable escape route, effectively hunting George in the same manner that George had been hunting him. At 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks. He entered the former machine gun nest and assumed a position facing eastward, towards the drainage ditch, toward the area where George was presumed to have relocated. The sniper was now a mere 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater, but crucially, he was facing the wrong direction. His back was exposed. George possessed a clear, unobstructed shot. Center mass, 38 yards. An elementary shot, even without the aid of his scope. Yet, George hesitated. This particular sniper had successfully evaded American operations in the Point Cruz groves for 10 grueling days. He had outlasted 10 other snipers, men who had met their end precisely because they had made critical errors. This man, George reasoned, would not make such mistakes. The position within the rocks appeared far too exposed, far too vulnerable. No seasoned sniper would linger there for more than a fleeting moment. This had to be another deception, another carefully constructed bait position. George maintained his scope's focus on the sniper in the rocks, but concurrently expanded his awareness to encompass the surrounding area. If this indeed served as bait, the genuine threat would be positioned to observe it, commanding a clear line of sight to anyone who dared to take the shot. At 10:06, George identified it. A second Japanese soldier, situated 70 yards northwest of the rocks, concealed behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier was not exhibiting any movement, nor was he repositioning, he was simply watching, patiently waiting. His rifle was aimed directly toward the drainage ditch, the presumed location of George's hiding spot. 2 men, not one. The 11th sniper had apparently brought reinforcements. Or, perhaps, these represented the final 2 snipers, numbers 10 and 11, working in concert. George made his decisive resolution. He recognized the impossibility of engaging both men simultaneously before they could effectively react. The bolt-action mechanism of the Winchester necessitated manual operation between shots. This would provide them with precious time to pinpoint his location and retaliate. He required an entirely different strategy. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the water. He submerged himself until only the very top of his head and his eyes remained above the surface. He held the Winchester pointed skyward, ensuring that no water entered the barrel. Then, he waited. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier who had occupied the rock stood up. He had spent 10 minutes intently observing the drainage ditch and had detected no sign of activity. He evidently concluded that George had advanced further eastward. He turned and signaled to his partner positioned behind the fallen tree. Both men commenced moving eastward, maintaining a distance of approximately 70 yards between them. They were executing a deliberate sweep, intending to flush George out or definitively locate his position. George remained submerged in the water, utterly motionless. The 2 Japanese soldiers advanced past his crater. They were now positioned between George and the tree line. Their backs were completely exposed. George slowly rose from the water. Silently, deliberately, he brought the Winchester to his shoulder. Water dripped from the barrel, from his uniform, from his face. He aimed at the closer soldier, the one who had been in the rocks, now 42 yards distant. George fired. The soldier dropped instantaneously. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, and swiftly swung the rifle toward the second soldier positioned behind the fallen tree. The man was already turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 3 arduous days. 11 Japanese snipers lay dead. George had successfully purged the Point Cruz groves of the pervasive threat that had claimed 14 American lives in just 72 hours. As George extricated himself from the concavity and collected his expended casings, a sound arrested his movement. Voices. Japanese voices originating from the dense foliage bordering the area. Several individuals were advancing towards the fallen servicemen. George had neutralized the snipers, yet these had not been operating in isolation. He retreated back into the crater. The water was frigid and murky. He submerged himself until only his eyes remained above the surface. He held his Winchester rifle upright to prevent water from entering the barrel. The Japanese voices intensified. At a minimum of 6 men, perhaps more. They were converging on the 2 deceased snipers. George discerned the snapping of twigs and the clinking of gear. These were not snipers. They were infantry. Either a patrol or a recovery unit dispatched to retrieve the bodies. George began counting seconds. The voices ceased at the position of the first casualty, a distance of 42 yards from his hiding place. Close enough that he could discern them distinctly, even without comprehension of their speech. Then, the voices shifted towards the second body. Further exchanges, imbued with a sense of urgency. At 10:28, the voices recommenced their movement, not back towards the tree line, but in the direction of George's crater. They had discovered his trail. Boot impressions in the mud, leading from the rocky outcrops to his current location. George had been meticulous regarding noise and bodily motion. He had, however, been careless concerning his tracks. George possessed 5 rounds remaining in his Winchester, facing a minimum of 6 Japanese soldiers. Unfavorable odds for a bolt-action rifle. He contemplated his options. Remain concealed and hope they passed by, or engage them. The voices drew nearer. 30 yards, 25 yards, 20 yards. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater's edge. He peered directly down at George. Their gazes locked. George discharged his weapon from the water. The soldier tumbled backward. George manipulated the bolt while still submerged, chambered another round, and emerged. 2 additional soldiers stood at the crater's rim. George fired, worked the bolt, and fired once more. Both soldiers collapsed. 3 rounds remained. George could hear shouts. More soldiers were approaching. He climbed out of the crater on its northern side, away from the approaching clamor. He advanced 20 yards and crouched behind a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire erupted through the jungle. Bullets impacted the earth in the vicinity of the crater and the downed tree. The soldiers were firing at movement, at sound, not at identified targets. George maintained a low profile. He surveyed the surroundings through his scope. He detected movement. 2 soldiers advancing towards the crater, 50 yards distant. George aimed at the leading soldier. He fired. The soldier fell. The second soldier dove for cover. 2 rounds remained. George heard more voices behind him. The Japanese were attempting to flank him. One group was approaching from the south, another from the east. George was on the verge of being encircled. He made his decision. He could not prevail in a direct engagement with a bolt-action rifle against multiple soldiers armed with semi-automatic weaponry. He needed to disengage and retreat towards the American lines. George seized his rifle and ran north. He sprinted through the dense jungle undergrowth. Vines ensnared his boots. Branches lashed at his face. Japanese rifle fire pursued him. Bullets whizzed past, struck trees, and kicked up dirt. George ran for 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed himself against the crater wall and listened. The Japanese voices had receded. They had not pursued. They were regrouping around their fallen comrades. George examined his rifle. Mud coated the stock, water still dripped from the barrel. He had 2 rounds left and no stripper clips. The clips were in his pack. The pack was somewhere near the water-filled crater. At 10:47, George resumed movement, not running, but walking, maintaining a low profile, utilizing the terrain for concealment. He proceeded northeast, towards the American positions. The jungle was silent. No voices, no movement, only the sound of his own respiration and the distant resonance of artillery. At 11:13, George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself. The sentry escorted him through. George proceeded to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. Morris requested a comprehensive debriefing. George complied. 11 Japanese snipers eliminated over 4 days. 12 rounds discharged against the snipers. 11 hits. Subsequently, a confrontation with infantry. 3 additional casualties inflicted. 5 total rounds expended in that engagement. Morris inquired about his ammunition status. George was down to 2 rounds. Morris asked about the rifle's condition. George stated it was functional but required cleaning. Mud had infiltrated the action. Water was present in the barrel. Morris instructed George to clean his rifle and get some rest. No assignments were scheduled for him the following day. The battalion was redeploying eastward. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a strategic objective. The Japanese forces were undertaking an evacuation from Guadalcanal. Intelligence indicated they would complete their withdrawal within 2 weeks. George returned to his tent. He disassembled the Winchester and spent 2 hours meticulously cleaning each component. Cosmoline and gun oil were applied. Patches were passed through the barrel until they emerged clean. He inspected the scope mounts, adjusted the eye relief, and loaded 5 fresh cartridges. At 1400 hours, a directive arrived from division headquarters. The battalion commander wished to see George. George proceeded to headquarters, contemplating whether Morris had submitted a negative report. Unauthorized engagement, excessive ammunition expenditure, operating independently without support. Instead, he found Morris and 2 other officers awaiting him. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry posed a single question. Could George instruct other men to replicate his actions? George indicated he could attempt, but it would necessitate time, rifles equipped with optics, and individuals possessing existing shooting proficiency. Ferry stated that the division possessed 14 Springfield rifles with unwritten scopes, sniper rifles previously utilized by the Marines, and Ferry commanded 40 men within the regiment who had achieved expert marksman status prior to deployment. Ferry desired George to establish a sniper detachment, train the personnel, devise tactical approaches, and eliminate any remaining Japanese snipers from American operational zones. George accepted, but with a single stipulation. He wished to retain his Winchester. Ferry approved the request. George retained his Winchester Model 70. The 14 Springfield rifles equipped with unwritten scopes were allocated to the men George would train. Instruction commenced on January 27. George assembled 40 men at a rudimentary firing range situated 2 miles east of Henderson Field. The men were proficient marksmen on paper. They had qualified with iron sights at distances up to 500 yards, but none possessed combat experience as snipers. None had ever terminated a human life from concealment. George began with the fundamentals: breath control, trigger manipulation, wind assessment. The Springfield rifles weighed 11 pounds with the unwritten scopes. Heavier than the Garand, heavier than George's Winchester. The weight lent stability to the rifles but proved fatiguing during prolonged holding periods. George instructed them to utilize any available support, such as rocks, logs, or sandbags. The jungle rarely afforded ideal shooting positions. Snipers had to adapt to the terrain and fashion stable platforms from whatever materials were at hand. Range training extended for 3 days. George had the men engage stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, followed by moving targets, and then targets partially obscured by vegetation. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could consistently strike man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George organized them into 16 two-man teams, comprising a shooter and a spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a rangefinder. His role was to identify targets and provide security while the shooter engaged. Following each elimination, the roles could be interchanged. This practice maintained proficiency for both individuals and mitigated the singular point of failure inherent in relying on a lone shooter. On February 1st, George led 4 teams into the field. Their objective was to neutralize Japanese positions west of the Matanico River. Intelligence indicated small groups of Japanese soldiers were still active in that sector. Not snipers, but infantry. Stragglers who had not yet completed their evacuation. The 4 teams moved into position at dawn. George partnered with a spotter named Corporal Hayes. They established a vantage point on elevated ground overlooking a pathway that the Japanese had been utilizing for resupply. At 0720, a Japanese soldier appeared on the path. Hayes confirmed the target through his binoculars. George fired. The soldier fell. George worked the bolt and scanned for additional targets. None materialized. Over the subsequent 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more Japanese soldiers on that path. 7 shots, 6 eliminations, 1 miss attributed to windage. The other 3 teams reported comparable outcomes. 23 Japanese soldiers were killed that day. 0 American casualties. The sniper contingent continued its operations through early February. By February 9, the section had accounted for 74 Japanese soldiers. This figure represented a conservative count, only including confirmed eliminations where the body was observable. The Japanese evacuation intensified during this period. Destroyers arrived nightly to transport troops from Cape Esperance, situated at the western extremity of Guadalcanal. American forces advanced westward to intercept the evacuation, but the Japanese mounted effective rearguard actions. George's sniper section was tasked with eliminating Japanese soldiers providing cover for the retreat routes. On February 7, George was operating near the Tanamboa River when a Japanese rifleman struck him. The projectile impacted George's left shoulder. The force of the hit spun him around and knocked him to the ground. Hayes dragged George to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious, but not life-threatening. The bullet had traversed muscle tissue without striking bone or major blood vessels. George was transported to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Medical personnel cleansed the wound and sutured it closed. They informed George that he would recover but required rest. No combat operations were permitted for a minimum of 3 weeks. George spent 2 weeks at the field hospital. During that interval, the Japanese successfully completed their withdrawal from Guadalcanal. On February 9, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it deserted. The campaign had concluded. George's sniper section had been active for 12 days. 74 confirmed kills, 0 friendly casualties sustained during sniper operations. The section received official commendation from Division Headquarters. Colonel Ferry recommended George for the Bronze Star. However, George's wartime service was not yet concluded. While he recuperated at the field hospital, orders arrived from Pacific Command. The Army required experienced combat officers for a new assignment, something in Burma, something classified. George volunteered. By March, George was aboard a transport vessel heading westward across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 was secured in a waterproof case within the cargo hold. The Lyman Alaskan scope was enveloped in oiled cloth. George lacked specific details regarding the Burma mission. He only knew it involved jungle warfare, extended reconnaissance patrols, and operations behind Japanese lines. The kind of assignment where an individual armed with a rifle capable of striking targets at 600 yards might prove invaluable. The transport reached India on April 3. George and 200 other officers were briefed on their impending assignment. They would join a new unit, comprising 3,000 men in total. The unit had yet to receive an official designation. The men, however, referred to themselves by another name. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The 537 Composite Unit was formally established on May 28, 1943, though the men had commenced training in April. This training encompassed long-range penetration tactics, jungle survival, and operations conducted without established supply lines. The unit structure was modeled after that of the British Brigadier Ordnance Chindits, who led small, mobile forces capable of operating deep within enemy territory for prolonged durations. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. His role was not officially listed as a sniper. The Army did not maintain formal sniper positions within its organizational structure. George was designated as a rifle platoon leader, yet Colonel Ferry's recommendation had accompanied him from Guadalcanal. The battalion command was aware of George's capabilities with a rifle. Training took place in central India. The terrain differed from Guadalcanal, but the underlying principles remained consistent. Intense heat, humidity, dense vegetation, and limited visibility. The Burmese jungle, however, promised greater challenges. Steeper gradients, heavier rainfall, and an adversary intimately familiar with the terrain, more so than any American force. George modified his equipment for the Burmese deployment. The Winchester Model 70 had performed admirably on Guadalcanal, but those operations were short-range and supported by regular resupply. Burma would necessitate patrols extending for weeks, covering hundreds of miles through dense jungle. Every ounce of weight was a critical consideration. George removed the Lyman Alaskan scope and replaced it with a lighter Weaver 330. The Weaver possessed the same 2.5 power magnification but weighed 8 ounces less. He also substituted the wooden stock with a lighter synthetic variant. These modifications reduced the rifle's overall weight from 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14 ounces. While seemingly a minor reduction, over a 2-week patrol carrying 60 pounds of equipment, every ounce was significant. The Marauders entered Burma in February of 1944. Their objective was to advance through northern Burma and seize the Myitkyina airfield. The airfield was crucial for Allied supply routes into China. Japanese forces controlled the area with approximately 4,000 troops. The Marauders would approach overland, traversing terrain the Japanese deemed impassable for large formations. This included mountains, rivers, dense jungle, and the absence of roads or even well-defined trails. The force would transport all necessary supplies on their backs or utilize pack mules. There was no motorized transport, no artillery support, only rifles, mortars, and the capacity to move swiftly through seemingly impossible terrain. George's battalion commenced the march on February 24. The initial week covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Soldiers succumbed to exhaustion. Malaria cases escalated daily. The pack mules struggled with the rugged terrain, and several had to be euthanized due to broken legs sustained on steep descents. By March, the battalion had covered 217 miles. They had engaged Japanese forces 12 times. These encounters involved small skirmishes, ambushes, swift firefights, followed by rapid disengagements. The marauders were not intended to secure territory. Their purpose was to advance, harass, disrupt supply lines, and sow confusion behind Japanese positions. George employed his Winchester on 3 occasions during the march. Once at a distance of 412 yards, targeting a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. Another time, at 380 yards, engaging a machine gun emplacement. And a third time, at 290 yards, neutralizing a sniper who had pinned down a marauder patrol. 3 shots, 3 eliminations. George never fired more than once per engagement. The distinctive report of the Winchester, unlike the sharp crack of the Garand, announced his presence. A second shot would have provided the Japanese sufficient time to pinpoint his location. George learned to fire and immediately relocate. The march to Myitkyina spanned 3 months. By late May, the marauders had covered over 700 miles. They had lost more men to disease than to combat, succumbing to malaria, dysentery, and typhus. The unit that entered Burma with 5,300 men had dwindled to fewer than 3,000 combat-effective soldiers. On May 17, the marauders captured the Myitkyina airfield. The operation was successful, but the toll had been exceptionally high. The unit was rendered combat ineffective. The casualty rate was too high, the number of sick too great, and the prolonged jungle operations had offered insufficient rest or adequate medical care. George survived the Burmese campaign. His Winchester also survived, yet the rifle that had proven so effective on Guadalcanal saw action only 7 times over 3 months of operations. The marauders rarely engaged in the kind of long-range, precision shooting that necessitated a scoped rifle. Most combat engagements were close-quarters ambushes at 50 yards or less, or firefights within dense vegetation where visibility extended barely 30 feet. George gained a realization during those 3 months in Burma. The Winchester Model 70 was an exceptional rifle, arguably the finest bolt-action sporting rifle ever produced. However, modern warfare was undergoing a transformation. Semi-automatic rifles, such as the Garand, were becoming standard issue. The conflicts to come would demand different weaponry and different tactical approaches. But for George, there would be no immediate subsequent war. By June of 1944, he was evacuated from Burma along with the remaining marauders. The unit was subsequently disbanded. George was reassigned to training duties within the United States. He never again fired his Winchester in combat. George returned to the United States in July of 1944. The Army promoted him to the rank of captain and stationed him at Fort Benning, Georgia. His responsibilities involved instructing infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He imparted the lessons he had acquired on Guadalcanal and in Burma. How to navigate jungle terrain, how to identify and engage targets at varying distances, and how to operate autonomously without reliance on supply lines. He retained possession of his Winchester Model 70. The rifle had journeyed from Illinois to Tennessee, then to Guadalcanal, India, Burma, and finally to Georgia. It had accounted for at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements, and likely more. George had ceased counting after Burma. The rifle resided in a footlocker within his quarters at Fort Benning. George rarely consulted it. The war had evolved. The Pacific Islands were being progressively reclaimed. American forces were advancing through France and into Germany. The demand for individual marksmen equipped with privately owned rifles was diminishing. The military was embracing standardization, mass production, interchangeable parts, and soldiers trained with identical equipment and uniform methodologies. George understood the inherent necessity. Modern warfare required industrial-scale efficiency. However, something valuable was being lost. The individual skill, the craftsman-like approach to soldiery. The notion that a man, armed with the correct rifle and possessing the appropriate training, could influence the outcome of a battle. George was honorably discharged from the Army in January of 1947. He held the rank of lieutenant colonel, possessed 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, and a Combat Infantry Badge. He returned to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton University, utilizing the GI Bill. He pursued studies in politics, graduating with highest honors in 1950. Following Princeton, George spent 4 years at Oxford University, and subsequently 4 years in British East Africa, undertaking studies in regional politics and institutions. He eventually established his residence in Washington, D.C., serving as the executive director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he joined the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute as a consultant and lecturer specializing in African affairs. Throughout these years, George never publicly discussed his experiences on Guadalcanal or in Burma. He had colleagues who were aware of his Pacific service, but they were unfamiliar with Point Cruz. They did not know about the Japanese snipers. They were unaware of the Winchester Model 70 that remained in its case at his home. In 1947, George resolved to document his experiences. Not for public dissemination, but solely for his personal record. He aimed to preserve details concerning the weaponry and tactics employed in jungle warfare while the memories were still vivid. He dedicated 6 months to this endeavor. The manuscript ultimately reached over 400 pages. A contact at the National Rifle Association, after perusing the manuscript, suggested its publication. George expressed reluctance. The book was technical, delving into intricate descriptions of rifles, ammunition, and ballistics. It was not content likely to captivate a general readership, but the NRA ultimately persuaded him. The book was published in 1947 under the title Shots Fired in Anger. It subsequently became a seminal work among firearms aficionados and military historians. The book chronicled George's encounters on Guadalcanal and in Burma with stark precision. It eschewed embellishment and hero worship, focusing solely on factual observations regarding what proved effective and ineffective in combat. The book continues to be printed today, serving as a reference for collectors and historians studying World War II small arms. George's accounts of Japanese weaponry remain among the most detailed contemporary records available. George lived to witness the United States engage in 3 additional conflicts: Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. He observed the evolution of military rifles, from the Garand to the M14 and subsequently the M16. He saw sniping formally recognized as a military specialty, complete with dedicated training and equipment. He witnessed the lessons of World War II being rediscovered and refined by successive generations of soldiers. John George passed away on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 that had eliminated Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal was subsequently donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. Resting within a glass enclosure, a descriptive plaque details its historical significance. The majority of onlookers pass by without pausing. At first glance, it appears to be an ordinary antique hunting firearm, yet it holds a unique distinction. This is the firearm that demonstrated a state champion marksman, equipped with a mail-order telescopic sight, could surpass the accuracy of professionally instructed military sharpshooters. It is the very weapon that secured a strategic position in just 4 days, a feat an entire battalion struggled to accomplish in 2 weeks. This firearm fundamentally reshaped the American military's perspective on individual marksmanship in contemporary combat. If this narrative has resonated with you as it has with us, please do us a favor and give it a thumbs up. Each like signals to YouTube that this story should be shared with a wider audience. Kindly subscribe and activate notifications. We are dedicated to unearthing and preserving overlooked narratives from forgotten historical records on a daily basis. These are tales of riflemen who demonstrated their prowess through skill and bravery. These are accounts of genuine individuals and authentic acts of heroism. Please share your location in the comments section immediately. Are you tuning in from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia? Our global community spans the entire planet. You are more than just a spectator, you are an active participant in preserving these memories. Let us know where you are viewing from. Inform us if any family members have served. Simply acknowledge your presence. We appreciate you watching and for ensuring that John George's legacy is not lost to obscurity. These individuals merit remembrance, and your engagement is instrumental in achieving that.